It all started one quiet afternoon when Karen, the infamous figurehead of the HOA, spotted something she didn't like. A new neighbor had moved in just a few weeks ago, and things had been peaceful until that day. Karen had always been on the lookout for any violation of the HOA rules. She prided herself on keeping the neighborhood orderly, but today she noticed something she was convinced was a serious offense. The new neighbor, a man in his 30s, had been working in his backyard for days. To Karen, it seemed like he was doing something suspicious. From her living room window, she could see him moving dirt, bringing in supplies, and, to her horror, setting up what looked like a small structure. Was this a shed, a gazebo, or, worse, a pool house? Karen's mind raced. Surely, he didn't have the proper permissions for this. She grabbed her phone and immediately dialed 911. Yes, I need to report illegal construction on private property, Karen said sternly into the phone. The dispatcher was calm and professional, asking questions, but Karen was getting more frustrated. She kept insisting that something illegal was happening and that the authorities needed to intervene. It's against the HOA rules. I want officers here right now, she demanded. The operator assured her that police would be sent to check it out, but Karen was already fuming. She felt like she was the only one in the neighborhood who took the HOA seriously. To her, this was a personal affront, and she was determined to stop this so-called construction before it went any further. What Karen didn't know, however, was that this would be the moment that would lead to her downfall. Karen stood at her window, waiting. She could see the man in his backyard, still working away, completely unaware of the storm about to hit him. She smirked, imagining the look on his face when the police showed up to shut him down. In her mind, she was a hero, saving the neighborhood from an eyesore and keeping things in line. Within minutes, the flashing lights of a police car appeared down the street. 2 officers stepped out and approached the man's property. Karen, of course, couldn't resist watching everything unfold from her porch, pretending to water her plants, but clearly waiting for the drama to begin. The officers greeted the man, who looked genuinely confused. They asked him some questions, and Karen felt a surge of satisfaction. Surely, the man had no permit for what he was building. She could almost taste the victory. She envisioned the officers telling him to tear down whatever he was working on. But something unexpected happened. The man calmly walked inside his house and returned with some papers. The officers reviewed them and nodded in agreement. Karen couldn't believe what she was seeing. What was going on? The police officers turned and headed toward Karen's house. Her heart raced. Were they coming to thank her for her diligence? Or maybe they needed more information from her to finalize the report. She was sure they were going to commend her for her efforts in keeping the neighborhood in check. But as the officers approached her, their expressions were less than friendly. One of the officers spoke first. "Ma'am, are you the one who called 911?" he asked firmly. Karen nodded, standing tall. "Yes, I did. This man is building something illegal on his property, and it's against our HOA rules. I demand that you stop it." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "Actually, ma'am, the man has all the necessary permits and permissions to build on his property. He's not violating any laws, and his structure is completely legal." Karen felt the ground shift beneath her. "What do you mean legal?" "The HOA didn't approve it," she snapped, her frustration growing. "That's not a matter for the police to handle," the officer replied calmly. "This is an emergency, and you shouldn't be calling 911 for something like this. If you have an issue with HOA regulations, you need to take it up with them. But as far as the law is concerned, this man is doing nothing wrong." Karen was furious. How could this be happening? She had been so sure that she was right, that she was protecting the neighborhood. But now the police were telling her she had wasted their time. The officer's next words hit even harder. "Ma'am, calling 911 for non-emergencies can be considered a misuse of emergency services. We're going to let you off with a warning this time, but don't do it again," the officer warned. "If there's a problem with the HOA, handle it through the proper channels." Karen stood there speechless as the officers walked back to their car. Her smugness had completely evaporated, replaced by embarrassment and anger. She glanced back at the man's house, where he stood watching from his yard, clearly aware of what had just happened. This wasn't the end, Karen thought to herself. She wouldn't let it end this way. Determined to win the battle, Karen decided to take her case to the HOA. She spent hours preparing her argument, pulling up old HOA regulations, and crafting a speech she believed would convince the board to take action against her neighbor. If the police wouldn't enforce the rules, surely the HOA would. After all, she had been part of this community for years. She knew the ins and outs of the regulations better than anyone. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and Karen marched in with a folder of documents and a mission. She took her seat and waited patiently for her turn to speak. As the board went through their agenda, Karen's mind raced with thoughts of how she was going to expose this neighbor for his so-called illegal actions. Finally, it was Karen's turn. She stood up, clutching her papers tightly, and addressed the board. "I'm here today because there's a serious violation happening in our neighborhood," she began, her voice filled with authority. She laid out her case, explaining in detail how the structure in her neighbor's yard was against the HOA rules and how it would negatively affect the community. Karen spoke passionately, convinced that the board would see things her way. But once again, she was hit with a reality check. After reviewing the situation and speaking with other board members, the head of the HOA responded with words Karen didn't want to hear. "Karen, we've already reviewed this issue," the head of the HOA said, his tone firm but polite. "The neighbor in question submitted all the necessary paperwork months ago. The structure he's building complies with both the HOA guidelines and city permits. There's nothing we can do. This case is closed." The room fell silent. Karen stood there, stunned. The board had completely shut her down. No one supported her. Her argument, her claims, her passion, none of it had mattered. Karen's face turned red with anger and humiliation. She tried to argue back, but the board wasn't having it. "Karen," the head of the HOA continued, "this is not the first time you made complaints like this. We had several reports about you over the past few months, and frankly, your behavior is becoming disruptive to the community. We urge you to reconsider how you approach these situations in the future." The message was clear. Karen had gone too far. Not only had she failed to stop the neighbor's construction, but she had also tarnished her reputation within the HOA. People no longer saw her as the diligent enforcer of the rules. Instead, she was becoming the troublemaker, the one who called 911 over trivial matters and wasted everyone's time. As Karen left the meeting, she could feel the stares of the other homeowners on her. They whispered amongst themselves, and Karen could sense their judgment. She had lost, and it wasn't just this battle. Her influence in the community was slipping away, and she knew it. Karen's once powerful presence in the neighborhood began to fade. Karen's downfall didn't stop with the HOA meeting. Word quickly spread around the neighborhood about her failed attempt to get the police involved over a minor issue. The residents, many of whom had tolerated Karen's constant meddling in their lives for years, were starting to lose their patience. They had always been wary of her strict enforcement of HOA rules, but now they saw her as nothing more than a busybody who couldn't mind her own business. Neighbors who used to greet her politely now avoided eye contact. Some whispered about her behind her back, while others openly mocked her for calling the cops on the new neighbor over what was clearly legal construction. Even the other members of the HOA board, who had once considered Karen an asset for her vigilance, were distancing themselves from her. Karen was no longer the enforcer of rules, but the subject of ridicule. The man she had called the police on had become something of a hero in the community. People admired how calmly he had handled the situation, and many had rallied around him, offering their support. He had become a symbol of resistance to Karen's overbearing presence. Meanwhile, Karen found herself increasingly isolated, but in her mind, she wasn't done yet. Karen still believed that she was in the right. She couldn't let go of the idea that the neighborhood needed her to maintain order, and that without her, everything would fall apart. The more people pushed back, the more determined she became to prove her point. She refused to accept that her time as the self-appointed guardian of the HOA was coming to an end. In the weeks following the HOA meeting, Karen's obsession with the neighbor's construction grew. She couldn't stand the sight of the new structure taking shape in his yard. It reminded her of her failure, of how the community had turned against her. Every time she saw it, Her anger flared. She had to do something, anything, to regain control. Karen began documenting everything her neighbor did. She took photos, wrote detailed notes, and even filmed videos from her window. She was convinced that if she gathered enough evidence, she could find some violation, some loophole that would force him to stop. But no matter how hard she looked, there was nothing. The neighbor was following all the rules. Then one day, Karen made a fatal mistake. Frustrated and desperate, she decided to confront the neighbor directly. She marched over to his house, knocked on the door, and when he opened it, she unleashed her anger. She accused him of ruining the neighborhood, of disrespecting the HOA, and of breaking the rules, none of which was true. The man, calm and composed as ever, simply listened. When she was done, he said, "Karen, you need to stop this. You're only making things worse for yourself." But Karen wouldn't listen. She was too far gone. She stormed off, muttering threats about taking things to a higher authority. Little did she know, her actions had consequences she wasn't prepared for. The neighbor had recorded the entire encounter on his doorbell camera, and when he shared the footage with the rest of the community, it quickly went viral in their local online group. People who had already grown tired of Karen's antics were shocked to see how far she had gone. The video showed Karen in a rage, spewing baseless accusations and refusing to listen to reason. That was the final straw. The HOA board, now fully aware of Karen's behavior, held a special meeting. They reviewed the video, along with the numerous complaints that had been filed against her. It was clear that Karen had become more of a problem than a solution. The board voted unanimously to remove her from her position of influence within the HOA. She was stripped of her privileges and banned from participating in any future meetings. But the sweet karma didn't end there. Neighbors who had once feared Karen's wrath now felt emboldened. They began openly challenging her, calling her out on every little thing she did wrong. They reminded her that she was no longer in charge, and they took pleasure in watching her squirm. Karen, once the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, was now a pariah in her own neighborhood. The community had turned the tables on her, and there was nothing she could do about it. The very rules she had used to control others were now being used to expose her flaws. And as for the neighbor, his construction project was completed without any further interference. It turned out to be a beautiful garden shed, something that added charm to the neighborhood rather than detracting from it. He continued living peacefully, while Karen's reign of terror came to an end. Sweet karma. Indeed, the story of Karen's downfall didn't stop at her removal from the HOA. As much as she tried to return to a life of normalcy, her reputation was permanently damaged. Word of her behavior had spread beyond the neighborhood. People in nearby communities heard about the infamous HOA Karen, who had tried to call the cops over harmless private property matters. But Karen still refused to learn from her mistakes. She remained defiant, telling anyone who would listen that she had been wronged, that the HOA had betrayed her, and that the neighborhood was falling apart without her leadership. But her words fell on deaf ears. No one was interested in hearing Karen's version of events anymore. The people around her had already made up their minds. In the following months, Karen's life became more and more isolated. Where she had once been the center of neighborhood gossip and activity, now she was simply ignored. Her phone calls to the HOA board went unanswered, and her emails, once filled with complaints about minor infractions by her neighbors, were promptly deleted. People who once feared her presence and her sharp tongue now treated her as an afterthought. Karen's isolation wasn't just social. Her once pristine house and yard began to deteriorate. With no one around to admire her perfectly manicured lawn, she stopped caring as much about its upkeep. Weeds sprouted in her flower beds. The grass grew uneven in the house, once a picture of suburban perfection, began to fade into the background of the very neighborhood she had once controlled. Meanwhile, the community thrived. Without Karen's constant interference, neighbors found themselves more relaxed, more willing to enjoy their surroundings. The man whose shed had caused such a commotion became a neighborhood favorite. He often hosted barbecues and invited the whole block over, something that would have been unthinkable under Karen's watch. The neighborhood had transformed from a place of tension and control into one of camaraderie and mutual respect. Yet Karen's sense of superiority never faded. she still believed she had been the victim in all of this. She never took accountability for her actions or realized how much her own behavior had led to her downfall. Her attempts to regain her former influence fell flat, as her neighbors had long since moved on. In the end, Karen had no one left control but herself.